Alright, so this might be a little bit weird because my sound didn't record on my camera when I shot this, but what we're looking at here is a 72 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. We're going to put coil springs and shocks on it. It's got the 350 Olds 2-barrel in it. It's kind of funny because when I was in high school, 2 or 3 of my friends had these cars, and they used to get pretty frustrated with me because they could not run my Nova. I actually had one friend spend a whole bunch of money on his Olds, and he still could not run the Nova. So anyway, these were pretty popular back in the day. It's basically the same thing as the Chevelle and the Skylark. It's the A-body, GM A-body. So we're going to get it up in the air. You know, you want to put your jack stands away from your control arms and your rear axle, obviously, because you're going to be able to have access to that, have it hang down as far as possible. So yeah, the next step will be we'll pull the tires off. I'll start with the front because that's usually the hardest out of the two, and then we'll move to the rear after that. Okay, before we even start, I want to show you the top of the shock here. This is in the front. They have that little square thing right there. That they want you to put the nut, you put the nut down on it, and you're supposed to hold it with that when you take it off, and that never never works. You can put an impact on there, it'll just spin, and you can take the time to use like the square open end, and then take the nut and loosen it up. But that takes a lot of time. I think it's a waste of time. I actually have a trick I do that just eliminates that. I mean, really, even a torch or a cutoff tool is faster than taking an open end and trying to get that off. So a lot of times those will just spin. If you take a long extension and a socket and put it over the old nut and move it back and forth, they almost always break off, and then it's free to go. Unless you're going to reuse a shock for some reason, it's fine to do that. There's no point in spending a whole bunch of time trying to hold that shaft and take that nut off. Usually they break off anyway. It gets rusty from being on there for several years. Some people take their vice grips and get in between the coil spring and try to hold that shaft with the impact. And that does work sometimes if you got enough room in there. But like I said, it's so much easier just to break it off. Most of the time you can do that with no issue at all, and it makes it a lot easier to just snap it off instead of messing around with trying to take it off the right way or try to take it with the impact. Alright, so I'm going to show you here why the impact doesn't work. I got the impact right there. So I just stuck it over the stud right there on the shock, and I ran the impact. And I know my sound's messed up so you can't hear it, but all it's doing is just spinning on the shaft there. It's not doing anything. The nut doesn't come out at all. So it's just a waste of time to even try that. That hardly ever works. So we'll move on to my trick, which is the long extension next. Alright, so you can see here I got a real long extension with a 9/16 socket. Deep well. That's going to go over the top of the shock. And all you just put on top of the shock right there. And then all you do is crank back and forth. And you'll see how quick this breaks. So I'm just pulling it back and forth. Putting a bunch of stress on that shock. You got to remember too, these shocks are old. So these things, 4 or 5 times back, it snaps off just like that. Literally 10 seconds of work. And you'll see here, you just pull it up. And it's broke off. There's no need to get out impact or a torch or a cutoff wheel. By the time someone gets out those kind of tools, it's already broke off. So I've never had this not work. Well, I mean, I have had it not work, but when I first got into the trade, a lot of these GM suspensions were like this, and I used to fight this all the time. And I don't even remember where I picked this trick up at, but it's literally the best way to get the bust off the top of these nuts on these shocks instead of playing around with the impact or the cutoff tool or torch or anything like that. The only time this may not work is some of the smaller cars like the S10s and stuff, where you don't have as much room to go back and forth. But even those, if you put a ratchet on top of it, you can usually go one way and then turn it 90 degrees, and then pull it back the same way. And even though you can't go back and forth, if you turn it and then pull on it, turn it and pull on it, they'll usually snap off. And like I said, it's a 10, 15-second thing instead of sitting there fighting it. So, I mean, these aren't as common now, but that's a great trick for getting those off. Alright, so that's kind of a bummer. I tried doing the same thing on the fastener side with the extension trick, and you can see here only half the bolt half the bolt broke off, which I've never seen that happen before. So try to get down a little bit closer here at the light. You can see that half the bolt is still down there and the other half broke off, which is kind of ridiculous. I've never had that happen before, but since I'm out of oxygen on my torch, I will just get the cutoff wheel and go ahead and cut the rest of it off. So yeah, only half the bolt came off. That's pretty crazy. I've never actually seen that. But anyway, it's not that big of a deal. We'll get the cutoff wheel out and cut the rest of it off. Should only take a few more minutes. And that's kind of some of the things you see on these older cars as far as that goes. So I went ahead and used the cutoff wheel and cut the rest of it off. Only took a few minutes. I ran the cutoff wheel through the fender, took the wheel off, and then ran the cutoff wheel through the fender, and just cut it off. It only took probably 3 or 4 minutes to get the rest of it off. So it's kind of a bummer that I did that, but again, it wasn't that big of a deal. And now we'll move on to the bottom of the shocks, take those 2 bolts out, and the shocks will slide right out. So as far as the front shocks go, that's the hardest part, is just getting that top bolt broke off or dealt with. Yeah, I mean, it's not really that hard, but if you try to do it the conventional way, it can be. Alright, so we're just going to zip these 2 bolts, 13 millimeter, I'm about to say half inch. Half inch, this is an old car, we use all standard on this. Zip it off with a 3/8 impact. You can see there all the rust that was in there. But get this second bolt out, and then the shock should fall down pretty much on its own. There's only, in these GMs, there's only 3 bolts holding the shock in, or the 1 nut and the 2 bolts. It's a little bit rusty, but mess a little bit. There you can go. You can see it's not the original shock. It's actually been replaced before with a Monroe, which is kind of a coincidence because we're putting Monroes back on it. But and there's where it broke off from the top and the 2 bottom. But you can see how rusty it is, how old it is. So it's definitely time for some new ones on this one. Alright, so we got them both out on the ground here. As you can tell, they're old and rusty and ready for be replaced. And the next thing we're going to do is move on to this coil spring here. Once you get the shock out, the only thing really holding the bottom part of the lower A-frame to the top is your ball joint. You can see there you got a little ridge on the rotor. But yeah, we're going to bust this ball joint out and go from there on that. Get that coil spring out. Alright, so we're going to, this is something you won't see too much of Hoopties. Hoopties wearing gloves. But this thing's pretty greasy under here, so this is the kind of grease that won't come off your hands too easy. So we're going to put gloves on for something like this. You can see in here all that built up grease and grime. That stuff gets on your hands, man. It's hard to get off. It's really hard to get off, especially that suspension grease. You can see you can't even see the cotter pin on that nut there for the ball joint. Even that's all greasy. So we're going to scrape some of that off and try to get it cleaned up a little bit before I even try to take anything apart. So yeah, probably one of the few times you'll ever see me wear gloves. I know a lot of guys wear gloves now. I'm old school. If I'm busting down a transmission on the bench or something like that, I wear gloves. But normally, I don't really think about it because I'm just so used to not wearing them. All right, before I took the ball joint down, I went ahead and removed the sway bar from the frame there. It's usually easier to take it off from the sway links, but those are obviously old and they would break if I would try to take them off. So you got two bolts, I think they're 9/16 bolts that hold that up on both sides. And if you don't take that off, you're not going to get a lot of movement on your lower A-arm to get the spring out. So it's easier just to drop that sway bar and allow the lower control arms to drop down as far as possible. Sometimes you can get those springs out without compressors if you get the control arm down far enough. So the next thing we'll do, we'll take this nut out here on the ball joint and separate that from the upper control arm. And that'll give you, and then your lower control arm will be free from the suspension, and you'll have access. And the other thing, you don't want to use a pickle fork between the steering knuckle and the upper control arm there, because you have a boot that holds your grease for your ball joint. And if you use a pickle fork, a lot of times you'll rip that or damage it. So if you take a sledge, a small sledge, and hit the side of this knuckle, it'll separate that without ever without damaging the boot. And you also want to make sure you got the jack under the control arm at this point when you go to separate that ball joint, because if you don't, you might have the spring go flying by itself anyway. Because once you take that upper nut off and get that ball joint loose, nothing's really going to hold your lower suspension to the car. So always make sure when you get to this point, you put a jack underneath it to support it, because that coil spring probably won't fly out if you do that, but you'll definitely slam the lower control arm down, and you don't want that. And like I said, these sway links are in pretty rough shape. They probably need to be replaced. So we'll let them know about that, and those aren't that expensive, but that wasn't on the list today. So the bushies are pretty wore out on it. But that'll be a job for another day if they want that replaced. So the next step will be to beat on that knuckle and get that ball joint loose. And if you just beat right there with a sledge, usually 3 or 4 good hits, it'll pop that right up, and then that releases the ball joint from the knuckle, and then you have full access to your coil spring at that point. Alright, so I hit it about 3 or 4 times, and I separated it, the ball joint popped up. Use this sledge. You don't need a super big one. You just whack on the side, and usually the control arm will pop up. You can see there's space there now. I left that bottom nut on the ball joint so that you have control, because once that pops out, it can go, your knuckle goes flopping around and flying. So you leave that nut on there a few turns, and you'll have control over the upper control arm and your lower control arm. And then you can just take that nut out and lower your jack down. So I got the ball joint out, obviously, and I should have done this before I dropped the ball joint out. I'm going to go ahead and remove the caliper now. You don't want all that stress on your brake line there. So we're just going to turn that, get this caliper out of the way, loosen it up, and secure the caliper out of the way, because you don't want that. Number one, you want to have access, and if you move the caliper out of the way, and again, put the jack underneath your control arm so that we don't go crazy. And then, you take out the 2 pins for the caliper, and then we will slide the caliper off and get it out of the way so we don't hurt that brake hose. And these, you can get these at the auto parts store. They're pretty cheap. This is OTC. It's actually a decent one, but you can get the cheaper ones at the auto parts store. You use one end of the hook to go into the frame, one hook to go to the caliper. And it's a good, easy way to keep your caliper out of the way without damaging the brake hose or the caliper, and secures it so you can do the rest of the work. And they're cheap. It's a good investment if you do any kind of suspension or brake work on a regular. Alright, so you can see here it's hung up. One end's on the frame and then the other end's on the caliper. And there's not a lot, there's no tension on that brake hose. That's being all held up by that brake hanger there. Like I said, that's a good investment if you do any kind of brake work or suspension work. So now we're going to move, go after this coil spring next. I think there we had a pretty big groove in the rotor, and the pads are grooved up pretty bad. But this has got a ton of tension on it. Right now, the only thing holding this control arm up is my jack. And that thing's got a ton of tension on it. So this is where you want to be careful. Sometimes you can lower these control arms down far enough to where they'll just come out on their own. but you know, they sell coil spring compressors that compress the coils, makes it a little bit safer. And this is something where you want to be careful with because you don't want that thing popping out on you. All right, so you can see here I'm using these old school coil spring compressors. These things are about 25 years. I've had these forever. They were cheap set when I got them, and they're dangerous. I had a set that has safety tabs on them, but they didn't fit too well in these coil springs. So I went ahead and used these, and you gotta be very careful when you use these things, man. You can see there that's almost, you know, only one end is popped in there. And there's a credible amount of tension on these, and you can never get them side by side or across from each other because just the way everything's always in the way. They have spring compressors that go up inside there through the control arm and compress them down. I don't actually have a set of those, but that's another option. But for now in this job, we're going to use these, and then I'll pull that coil spring out and I'll use the impact to loosen them. But you got to be very careful. There's so much tension on this right now. If that would pop off, you could easily get injured. So this is not something to play around with. Just take your time and be careful when you do these. All right, so now we got the spring out. It's on the floor. We'll use an impact, and you can see this is literally like having a bomb on your floor. So you want to be off to the side of it. Don't get too close to it with your face or get on this, you know, in its path. But I'll use an impact and zip both of those off, and then you'll feel a little bit better once that thing's unloaded. Because right now, you know, I've actually seen these shoot across the shop floor before. It's not pretty. They can do some serious damage. So be careful when you're doing this. And I'll use an impact, zip them down, get the tension off them, and then we'll feel a lot better about it because won't be able to hurt anybody. All right, here they are side by side. These are actually pretty close in length. A lot of times the newer one will be a little bit taller when they're side by side like this, just because it's new and it's not been settled yet. So, and then this tab right here, you want to line up with the bottom of your control arm. There's a hole there, so you want to make sure you have it lined. All right, so we got the new spring set in there, and it's lined up with the hole on the bottom. The jack's underneath it, obviously, and I jacked it up a little bit. Took one of the compressors off, and I still got this one on there. I'm going to kind of leave this on there for a little while until I get the spring straightened out. Right now it's got a pretty bad curve in it. It could pop out. So I'll jack the lower control arm up a little bit to where it's safe to remove that. And you can see in this picture here that there's not a lot of room to put a socket or something on that coil spring compressor. So you're going to have to take an open end and crank away at it. It's one of the bad things about these style, you know, like I said, there's not a lot of room to work with, really. Once the control arms are all in there and you get it in there, and there's not a lot of room to put these compressors to begin with. So, and then there's a tab down here on the bottom. It's hard to tell in this camera, but there's a little hole in the bottom of the control arm, and that's where the beginning of the coil goes. So that's all lined up. And you may have to rotate the coil a little bit once you get it in there, but make sure you do that. It's oriented right. And then at this point, you know, like I said, I will jack up the lower control arm, start taking pressure off, start putting pressure on that coil and taking pressure off of that compressor, and then we'll unscrew the compressor completely out after the control arm's kind of level. And then, you know, then it's safe. The spring can't pop out on you, so then it'll be safe to remove that. All right, so now the new coil spring's seated in there. It's pretty well straight, and you can see I got the upper control arm back into that knuckle, got the nut on there and tight. So at this point in the installation, you're pretty safe. There's no way that coil spring can pop out at you. You know, there's only really two things that hold your upper and lower control arms together besides the knuckle, and that is your upper ball joint in that nut that I just showed you, and then your shock. So if your shock's out and the upper ball joint's out, there's nothing connected to that control arm. So from here, you know, you put your shock back on and your brake calipers, and it's pretty much, this side would be pretty much done. But like I said, jack up your control arm slow on this, and get your upper ball joint lined up, and go ahead and torque it down. And then once you get to that point, there's no worry of that coil spring coming out at you, or your jack slipping. Even if your jack would slip, at that point you're fine. Alright, so we're ready to put the shock up. This is pretty basic stuff here. So you got the shock. We'll get a bushing washer. We'll put that on first. And then you get a bushing. And you slide that on. And then you'll slide the shock up through the control arm into the frame, and then after you do that, you put a bushing on, another bushing, and then another bushing washer, and then you're ready to put your nut on. A lot of times what I do is I start the bottom ones. I'll get a couple threads and get those started, and then when you tighten the front top shock down, don't go crazy and over torque that. You just want that bushing to puff out a little bit. If you go too tight on it, the bushing will be ruined pretty quickly. So they're not meant to be 150 foot-pounds of torque. Just get your socket on there and run it down until they start to puff out a little bit, and that's good enough. You don't want to go crazy on that. And like I said, start the two bottom bolts before you worry about the top. Alright, so I got these two bolts started. I got the top actually done too already. So we'll just zip these back down. Two 9/16 bolts. Zip them back down at the impact, and those are good to go. And then I already did the top. I don't know if it's going to be kind of hard to see, but like I say, you just tighten it till that bushing, it's kind of hard to tell. You just tighten it until that rubber bushing puffs out a little bit, and that's good enough. Don't go crazy on that. I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but you'd be surprised how many come in that I've seen where they're just tightened all the way down, and the bushings popped out of there, half popped out of there because someone over torqued them. Alright, so the front's all done now. Went ahead and put the sway bar back up. You know, there's two bolts on each side. You just run those up, torque them down. Secure the sway bar. Got the front, both sides are done. Got that side in. Got this side in. So we'll move to the back at this point. This actually didn't, sometimes I get scared taking little sway bar bolts out and stuff like that on a car this old, because you never know what'll break off or get stripped out or whatever. But this actually went pretty smooth for this age of a car. The passenger side actually went really well, going back together, better than the driver's side actually, as far as getting the coil set in there. So yeah, pretty much the hard part's over. Now we'll move to the back and start on that. All right, we're on the back, and what do we see here? We see the good old-fashioned air shock. What good 60s or 70s muscle car didn't have air shocks back in the day. So you can see they've seen better days. They're probably 25, 30 years old, maybe older, who knows. But yep, got the old, these things were really rusty back here. The back half of the car is a lot rustier than the front half. These bolts look wet, and it's because I already sprayed them down with some PB Blaster. And we're going to hope and pray that these all come off without breaking. Yeah, so what I normally do, I take the bottom loose, and then I'll do the top. And then these things should just slide out theoretically, as long as those tops kind of worry me because it's pretty rusty under here. But we'll see. Those aren't real big bolts. Even if they would snap off, we can just replace them. They don't go into the frame or anything. It's just bolts that come down from the top. Alright, so some days it's better to be lucky than good, and was able to get these bolts off without them breaking or doing too much dramatics. Got the old shock off. That's where the top bolts go, through there. You can see how rusty that is. The bolts come in down through the frame, and then you get, there's a nut facing you, and then the other end goes on there. and I usually leave the bottom on and get the top loose. See, with those there, I break them loose with the ratchet, and you can see the bolts. They go through these two holes up here in the frame, and there's enough room. They come down, the nut faces you, and there's enough room in between the body and the frame to get an open end up in there, right there. And that's a half inch on this car, and you get a half inch open end or box end up there, and you hold it while you're cranking the nut off, underneath, and you get it loose. What I do is I get it loose with the ratchet, and then put the old 3/8 impact on it with a long extension and just zip it off after that. They're not very long bolts anyway, so it doesn't take long. And then I'll pull the other shock off on the other side before I pull that coil spring out right there, because your shocks will hold your rear end closer to your body, and you want as much movement down from your rear end as you can get when you pull these coil springs out. Most of the time on these rear-wheel drive coil springs, you don't need a coil spring compressor. You can pull down on the axle far enough that you can get the coil spring out without the compressor, which is nice because you're not dealing with that. So that'll be the next thing. And that's also, if you have the opportunity to have somebody help you, it's a good time to get somebody to help you with this part of it. Just a little side note on the passenger side, they have this brake line, or not the brake line, the fuel line going right there by the frame, and then they have the exhaust there if you got single exhaust. Of course, if you got dual exhaust, you have to deal with that on both sides. But it's hard to get a full-size box end in there, so I just use a little stubby box end, and that fits up there real nice. It's a little harder to hold it when you're taking it loose, but I think it's the way to go as far as holding it up there, because GM decided to put that fuel line right there, the exhaust is right there, and it's not super hard, but it can be frustrating with the full-size box end. So if you have a little stubby wrench and you can get it up, it's much easier to get that up in there. Alright, so I took the coil spring out here on the driver's side. Use this really long pry bar here. Get it between the trailing arm and the rear axle there, and pull down on it. And you can see the jack underneath the rear end there. It's not actually holding the rear end up right now. The rear end's off. It's just held on by the trailing arms at this point. There's no tension from the jack there in the middle. And like I said, it's easier if you have two people, one person to pull down that long pry bar and one person to grab the coil spring. Of course, I'm by myself, so I don't have that luxury. So that's why I got such a long pry bar there. And anyway, you just pull down on it as hard, get it to where the rear end will drop down far enough where you can just grab that coil spring and pull it out. There's not much tension on it. Once you pull that rear end down, really there's not much tension on it, even without pulling down on it. These rear coil springs aren't as dangerous as the front. So I'm not saying you can't get hurt. I don't know. Normally it's the front that you have the problems with. But again, you want your jack staying away from the control arm, the trailing arm, so that they can drop down as far as possible. And then you just get in there and pry down on it. I use a different method, putting it back up, because like I said, the newer ones are usually a little bit taller than these, and I barely got this one out doing this. Alright, so here I got the coil in on the driver's side. Again, the jack is not doing anything right there. It's not actually touching the pumpkin right there. But I took the drum off, and you can see the axle there. It's got the holes. So I just took my snap-on pry bar and put it in there and pulled down straight. It just didn't, with the other pry bar going off to the side, I just didn't have the leverage I needed by myself to pull the axle down far enough to get the coil spring in there. I needed about another inch or two. Probably about an inch, actually. It was close. But pulling down in the middle of the axle like that was just enough of what I needed to get the seat back on the axle there. Again, if you had two people helping you or another person helping you, it'd be much easier. But yeah, you just stick a pry bar in there and you pull straight down on it, and it was enough to get that coil spring seated on there. and then you want to make sure that you turn it where it was before. But yeah, that's we'll go ahead and do the same thing on the passenger side. And like I said, then you put the shocks on. You want to leave your shocks off until you get the coil springs replaced. Otherwise, it's almost impossible. All right, so at this point, both of them are in. You know, make sure that they're seated properly before you start jacking the rear end up. This is where your jack comes back into play. Is you'll want to put it under the pumpkin there and start jacking it up, because your shocks won't reach. It'll be, you know, the top of your shock won't reach the frame. So just get your jack underneath the pumpkin there and jack the whole axle up in the middle. And then at this point, you're ready to start putting your shocks back on and buttoning this thing up. So again, now's the time where we would put the shocks on and get this thing off the chain.
Sorry about that. My battery went dead on my camera. Anyway, the fronts were pretty even when you put them side by side or stand them up next to each other. They were pretty close to each other. So the fronts kind of went how they pretty much went in the way they came out. And these rears were a little harder to get in than what they came out, but like, you know, it really depends. Like I've done Jeep lifts on Jeeps where their springs are taller, then you're really going to have hassle getting them in. But in general, if you get a factory spring, like this is just your factory OE spring, it'll go in a little bit harder than what the old ones came out, but won't be too bad. And then, like I said, if you're going to lower the car, the spring will be shorter and it'll be easier to get in. So it's just a tip. It's not really a tip, but just a little knowledge on that. If you're having trouble getting it back in, you can't figure out why it came out easier than it went back in, that's why. Because normally these springs take about 6 months sometimes to actually settle to their actual ride height. So anyway, and the car might sit up a little higher than normal, which I'd already warned the customer about that. Almost any time you change coil springs, your car is going to sit up a little bit higher unless you go with lowering springs. So anyway, that's we'll move on to putting the rear shocks back on this thing, getting it off the stands. All right, so the new shock came with different hardware. So basically, they want you to pull this hardware out, which it has a big nut on the other end of this. So I got it loose all the way till it's flush and then beat on it with a hammer, and this came right out. I don't know what the big deal is, what the difference is, but basically now they have, it's hard to tell, now they have, if I can get it out, they have this that goes through the shock this way, and then there's a nut and a spacer that goes on this side. So it's just a different way to hold the shock, but it's basically the same concept either way you go. But since it came with a new shock, we're going to use the new hardware. Alright, so I'm pretty much wrapped up with this 72 Cutlass. The back's done. I wish I could have showed more what I did back there. Need to get like a little tripod or something for my camera, because it's pretty hard to show things and then hold the camera at the same time. But you can see here we got a bunch of old rusty parts. The shocks and the springs definitely need to be changed. These springs have definitely seen better days. Old school air shocks and coil springs. So these old A bodies ride pretty good when they're on point. So it should ride and hit bumps a lot better. Might be a little bit higher in the air for a little bit till the springs settle. That's about it. I don't know. Some mechanics don't like, or technicians don't like working on these older cars. I don't really mind. I cut my teeth on these kind of cars. These cars were actually old when I was in high school. And, I learned a lot of my base knowledge on cars like this. We all had, old cars similar to this. I had Novas and Camaros and stuff. And so anyway, I don't, a lot of guys don't like working on them because they're rusty and things go wrong, bolts break off, stuff like that. I don't normally mind working on it too much. I mean, obviously I'd rather work on a nice, clean car, but like I said, I kind of cut my teeth and learned a lot of knowledge on these type of cars, so I don't really mind it. I don't really know the backstory of this car. It's the first time I worked on this car, or worked on anything for this customer, so who knows, I might see it again. I don't know how far they want to take it. I know it needs front pads, rotors, sway links in the front, and it needs valve cover gaskets. It was smoking when I pulled it in. I popped the hood, and right away it's leaking pretty bad down here. You can see it's real wet on the head. Valve cover's definitely leaking pretty bad. But yeah, that's about it for this one. It took me about, I'm guessing about 2.5 hours. I got interrupted a few times. If you're not really used to doing suspension work and you want to do something like this on your own, plan on taking a little bit longer than that, maybe 4 or 5 hours. I mean, the first shop that I worked at, that's all I did was suspension and engine repair, head gaskets, timing belts, rack and pinions, suspension. So if you're not real familiar with that kind of work, it's going to take you a little bit longer. I would just say be careful with the coil springs. Don't get hurt. Take your time. If you don't know something, stop what you're doing and get the knowledge you need to continue, and be safe with it. Other than that, we'll get this thing off the stands and get the Hoopty back on the road.